Welcome to the Unvarnished Mind. This is Dalbir.
And this is Diogenes.
Okay, so for this podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Diogenes on a book he just read called What is Philosophy? And this is written by, oh, I'm so terrible with the French pronunciation. It says Gilles Deleuze,
Yeah,
uh,
so
as well as his mate, right? Guattari, Guattari,
now here.
Felix Guattari, right?
Yeah, yeah. So no, so the original, so this is obviously a French book. I read it in French.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, camera's not picking up very well, but yeah, it's Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? Okay, and it's by F Felix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze. Um, and I'll just give you a brief background on these people. Gilles Deleuze is known as one of the three big French postmodernist philosophers. So with the other two being Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. And these three thinkers are associated with the intellectual movement called postmodernism as it manifested in philosophy, because it also manifested in art, possibly earlier. But as a philosophical movement, it's associated with these three thinkers. So that's Deleuze. And Felix Guattari co-authored some of Deleuze's most famous books, this being one of them. And he was kind of an autodidact who kind of taught himself psychoanalysis. And both of these individuals were also kind of active in the what we refer to often as the anti-psychiatry movement in the 1960s and 70s, where they were
Okay.
very critical of psychiatry as a practice. Um, and so, yes, and I should say, yeah, one of the most famous works as part of that was called in English, Anti-Oedipus, Anti-Oedipe in French. And that's a reference to the Oedipus complex, um, for viewers who know about that. But we won't get too lost in that. We're going to talk about what they think about what philosophy is. Um, yeah, this book came out in what the 90s, and um, I found it very interesting. I recently
Oh, this
finished.
came out in the 90s.
I believe so.
So he died in 95, didn't he?
He died
Deleuze
in
was.
'95. This was one of his last works.
Okay.
It was much later than Antiope, which was, I believe, in the early 70s. Um, yeah, 1991. Yeah, um, yeah, 1991. Yeah, and yeah,
So,
Deleuze. Yeah, I should say Deleuze is very. I find him very different from the other two postmodernist thinkers, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Postmodernism, it's um, it's kind of a bit of a vague sort of term, kind of like continental philosophy, but nonetheless, it's a movement about skepticism. There was another famous postmodernist philosopher called Jean-François Lyotard, and he wrote a book called, or he wrote a short work on what is postmodernism. I forget what the actual title is of it. And he said postmodernism fundamentally is a skepticism of meta narratives, um, and modernism as a philosophical movement. Well, it wasn't really. Well, I guess the first modern philosophy would go back to what we call the moderns in philosophy, are like be Descartes and that sort of period. But any sort of meta narrative, Hegel would be a meta narrative, the idea that history is going towards one direction, all of human
mm,
history. Talking about universals, postmodernism is very critical of that, and so it's fundamentally a movement of skepticism. And Foucault, fundamentally, he questions, he thinks a lot of basically the way we think, such as scientific discourses, um, comes down to sort of a struggle of power. He's very Nietzschean. And you could say actually Nietzsche kind of underlaid some of the foundations of postmodernism, especially as it manifests in Foucault. Deleuze also wrote a brief book on Nietzsche, so he influenced Deleuze very much. And Derrida talks about language a lot, and he thinks all of language is ultimately like all of our beliefs are fundamentally just discourses, and which is something Foucault also says. But he thinks it's all sort of based on a sort of he kind of reduces everything to language. He has a famous kind of he has a famous quote, which is kind of a misquote, which is "There's nothing outside of the text." Um,
Okay.
yeah, il n'y a pas hors de texte, I think is in French. And so he's very famous for saying that yeah, words don't fundamentally mean anything concrete. It's always a sort of circular definition. If you go into a dictionary and you look a word up, that word is defined in terms of words, and each of those words are defined in terms of other words, and so on and so forth. And there's no real. It's all sort of a contingent process, and there's no like really rhyme or reason to it. And he's famous for talking about this. I forget what it is in French, but a sort of there's this free play between words, which he refers to as signifiers. But anyhow, so Deleuze I find is kind of different from either of them because he kind of sets up philosophical systems, I think, much more than the other two. Foucault and Derrida are really just kind of tearing things apart more. That's my general impression. We can go into specifics in other episodes, and perhaps that's sort of those are sort of overgeneralizations, perhaps. But Deleuze actually kind of sets up systems, certainly in this book, and in his big work, Différence et Répétition, which came out in the 60s. That fundamentally is described as a work of metaphysics, and he kind of sets up a system. Well, I'm repeating myself now, but yeah, it's he actually makes sort of positive claims. Kind of, he's famously very, very difficult to understand, Deleuze. But I should say, I didn't find this book that impossibly impenetrable. I think it's one of the more doable of Deleuze's books, much more so than like Anti-Oedipe or Difference and Repetition, Différence et Répétition. Um, so I
All
should
right. So what?
say, yeah.
Can I,
What do
if
you
I
want
can
to say?
interrupt? So just rather than giving all the background, because I'll inquire on the background if necessary. But
Mhm.
could you perhaps tell me what it is that this book is about? So what is philosophy? If you were to
Yeah,
answer this question, what does Deleuze
self-explanatory.
think philosophy is? Because I mean, we were planning to do another episode on what we think philosophy is using sort of more well-rounded perspective. Um,
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the
but
it's one of the main reasons why I read this book was to answer this question. As people are very interested in philosophy, this is something people always ask you. What actually is philosophy? It seems just like sort of these sort of is it just asking deep questions, sort of this general,
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and
yeah,
I think the definition by Russell is a bit incomplete, but I think from I have not read this book. I'm not very familiar with this text, but from what I understand, this is a very he provides a very different definition, and frankly, not a definition I quite understood. So, if you were to answer in the words of Deleuze, what is philosophy? What does he say philosophy is about? Because he provides a bit of a contrarian point of view here.
yeah. I'm not sure whether or not it's contrarian. Definitely contrarian to someone like a Bertrand Russell you mentioned, who's one of the fathers of analytic philosophy and very mathematically influenced. Um, Of course, Deleuze actually does mention Russell in this book, as well as mathematics. But to answer the question, not get lost on tangents, fundamentally what they say, and we're going to have to unpack this statement, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they say philosophy is the creation of concepts, concept creation. That's what it is. And so, of course, that begs the question: what is a concept for these people? Um,
Okay.
but yeah, I do want to go back to this book in another episode and sort of give more specific quotes because I feel like I didn't highlight key passages as much as I would like to and give specific examples of these things. But Yeah, he says that's a famous claim that they make in this book is philosophy is the creation of concepts. That's what philosophers do. And they say this is I remember listening to watching a episode with Deleuze, um, famously very raspy voice. He was a lifetime smoker. It's rather difficult to understand him.
Mm.
Um, but he says the idea that philosophy is mere reflection is absurd. It's absurd. He says no, the idea, yeah, no, what he says is, yeah, the idea that mathematicians need philosophy to just reflect on mathematics is absurd. So he is
The
juxtaposing,
idea that the mathematicians need philosophers.
yeah, that mathematicians or maybe other fields of study as well need philosophy in order to reflect what he calls reflect.
Hmm.
This sort of general reflection. He says no, that's not precise enough, and that's not. They don't need that just to reflect on their own fields. They can do that without philosophy. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
funny because I'm sure many mathematicians and scientists would agree.
yeah,
Do away
look,
with the philosophers. We don't need them. They're all rubbish. Meandering about, asking pointless questions to waste our time. We don't have time for this rubbish. Which is exactly why I would say that yes, you don't have time. That's why we give this work to the philosopher to work on, right? Of course, anyone can do inquiry, as Deleuze says it. His famous things like, oh, like anyone can do this work of inquiry, which is, I guess, true. Anyone can do mathematics as well if they just have the requisite time. I don't quite know what he means by that. But yeah, sure. Well, yeah, sorry, continue.
yeah, sure. And yeah, so I want to go more into detail, perhaps later into yeah, what exactly does he mean by a concept? Um, because he's juxtaposing that with this sort of general reflection. And I should say as well, throughout the course of the book, what they're doing is they're juxtaposing philosophy as creating concepts. That's sort of the fundamental unit of perhaps we could call it a unit of analysis or the entity which is the object of the study or the intellectual practice. They juxtapose philosophy as doing that, and then there's two other main domains of the mind, the activity of the mind, the intellect. That is art and science, and those are not to be confused with philosophy. I think the notion of science would include probably mathematics largely, not entirely. I'd have to go back to that. Like I said, they do discuss mathematics. Um, but they say, yeah, so they say that science is about measurements, and they say the fundamental unit that science works with is la fonction, the function. And they say, yeah, science is all about working with the function. You can see they create their own jargon. That's why it's important to unpack each of
Yeah, what do you mean by yeah
yeah. Yeah,
the
the function.
function?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I think we're gonna have to go back because I need to dig out specific I think passages. So I'll try to find some
I
now, but
also take objection to this term that science you say is about measurement.
yeah, it's one of the fundamental things it does according to them. Yeah, is taking measurements. Yeah,
I find that very silly. I mean,
you find that I no, but you see okay, so I'll go into this. There's a famous he was famous at one time as being kind of an atheist. His name was Peter Atkins. He was a chemistry professor at Cambridge, I believe it was.
the
And
famous
he
Atkins diet, right?
no, not I don't think definitely not named after something.
Oh,
Was it
really? There's no
Peter Atkins?
relationship.
All right, let me just double check that this I got this bloke's name correct. Um,
Peter Atkins.
anyhow, Dr. Atkins, and he's famous. And he says philosophy is doing absurd things. Um, it's completely absurd and meaningless. Yeah, yeah, Peter Atkins. Yes. Um, okay, no, it was at Oxford. He was a professor of chemistry at Oxford, and yeah, he's a very famous atheist. He
Okay.
said it's funny. His argument against the existence of God was basically saying that everything is that nothing exists. It's very nothing exists. And not only does God not exist, all of reality doesn't exist according to him. Very kind of absurd argument. He says the it doesn't mean it doesn't really make sense to me, but he says it's there's just there's positive charge and negative charge everywhere, and it all comes up to zero. It all like they all balance one another. I think there's so much dark matter or absence of matter, and that's all the negative, and the rest is positive. It all balances out to zero, so therefore nothing exists, and there's no God. It's kind of actually it's the
The
obverse.
opposite of girls.
Yeah, you have Gödel's. Yeah, it's the opposite of Gödel's case, which is that yeah, everything exists. Um, I remember learning about this in philosophy of religion class. Therefore, God exists because everything exists.
But, hey, let's hold
Yeah,
off on these
yeah.
statements because I'm sure they're
No,
straw
so,
man's, mate.
okay, so,
This
yeah, no,
can't
no,
be the
no.
real argument that because the charge sums
The
up to zero.
worst sort of straw man he would probably do. Uh, these are like
Uh,
very intelligent people, and we're just yeah, making garbage summaries of what they said. But nonetheless, I think I remember. So he was debating William Lane Craig, a famous Christian apologist, and uh, and philosopher. And I remember him saying it was completely absurd, and in the debate he was having with Peter Atkins. This is just such an absurd statement. What he's saying makes no sense. Um, at the
yeah,
very least, you could say the separation of charges constitutes something, an entity. But anyhow, we've gotten on a tangent here, as we want to
yeah.
do.
Let's get back to the
The reason why I mentioned Atkins was he said philosophy is totally absurd, and he said what philosophers don't do. He said all they do is wonder at things. So they just wonder at like the moon being up there, or they wonder about this and that. And he said what the scientist does is he goes out and measures it. That's what he said. The scientist goes out and measures it. Yeah, and then calculates. Although I think the first thing he said was measure. I'm not sure if I'm putting words in his mouth by talking about calculation. It kind of I might be blending another famous quote about science, which is in a similar vein, which is um, it's just shut up and calculate. Just shut up and calculate. Dawkins quotes this a bit. Richard Dawkins. Don't ask these time wasting questions. Just shut up and calculate. Don't worry too much about the theoretical underpinnings. That's how you proceed. So yeah, I would disagree with you. Perhaps you can go into why you think it's a silly proposition, but them talking about measurements as a fundamentally scientific practice. Um, I don't know. To me, it
no,
doesn't.
no, 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 why?
That's,
No, I was objecting to it just because I think
yeah,
to say
because
that science. I'm trying to come up with a good analogy here. Um, I can come up with a very strange, a funny one. It's like saying the purpose of eating food. I think we discussed this before. The purpose, it's like saying the purpose of eating is to take a shit the next day. That's the purpose of eating. Of course, it's a consequence, but that's not the purpose. It's like to say,
mm,
human life is about taking shits. That's so the
no,
reason. No, I was to say science is about measurement.
no.
No,
But they never,
it's different. So science consists, of course, empirical science consists of taking a lot of measurements, but the purpose of science is to understand the world, right? Create. We are creating. He talks about creating concepts. We create many concepts in science as well as mathematics, right? And we create concepts to understand the world empirically in order to make um, predictions about the world, to understand why the world works in certain ways, and make predictions. So that's really the purpose of science. And in order to understand the world accurately, we have to make precise measurements, but we also have to create new theories and understandings and concepts and frameworks in which to understand the world. But to say that science is about measurement, it's a means to an end. It's not what science is about. If we could
yeah.
obtain these, if we can obtain the measurements of the sort of positioning and this sort of without actually calculating computing measurements, scientists would be very happy. People, I don't think many scientists enjoy going to the lab and pipetting and using instrumentations and pipetting things. People who think they're scientists because they pipette stuff in the lab are morons. That's not what you're basically a laborer. That's just manual labor that you're doing. The purpose of science is now to take these, make precise measurements and understandings of the world, right? Precisely, you can look and you when you're looking at things, you're sort of making measurements, or when you drop a ball and it falls to the ground, you are sort of making an observation. This is a very precise form of making observations. Measurements are a very precise form of observation, and you're using these observations to create a framework for how the world works. That's what science is about. But to say science is about measurement is just such a moronic statement. I have a hard time believing this man was a moron, but at least that statement, the wording is ludicrous in my opinion.
No. Perhaps. I mean, you seem to think it implies a sort of teleology of science, or sort of this is the final end of science, is to make a measurement. For just because I make a measurement, like, but there's no understanding. Like, it's not just about like measuring and that's it.
Yeah, I tickle this measurement.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another measurement. And like, and there's no
So
statement attached to it.
I dropped the ball from here. It took exactly 1.273, and the whole enterprise of science is adding a new decimal place to the time it takes for this ball to drop. It
I
just
just recall the time. That's it.
yeah, yeah. That's it.
I know, but of course there's theory. Of course there's theory. Like, of course, no. The end is to, I mean, that's what Atkins was saying. Is that, like, this attaches you to the empirical world, the world of This is like the fact that I come up with a concrete measurement of it. Means that I'm dealing with reality, objective reality, as opposed to hand waving, which Atkins would say is philosophy. Um, so the philosophers don't measure anything, because they're all dealing with unmeasurable quantities, which are mere ideas and speculations. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
so are scientists philosophers now? Is it a sufficient condition by creating concepts? Are you now a philosopher in Deleuze's mind? Because scientists and mathematicians create many concepts.
they do well. Yes. So, but that's the thing. This exists within its jargon. I think this is a general thing in philosophy, general practice in philosophy. You've got to. I think it's so important to realize that people use the words in different ways. Me and you have a general colloquial notion of what a concept is, that we kind
Okay.
of use to refer to things. I mean, this goes into kind of the Derridian discussion, Jacques Derrida's, description of language, and it goes into philosophical questions about what is the final reference of words, something discussed in analytic philosophy. Um, but yeah, when you're talking about, yes, of course, we talk about concepts existing in science. Um, but yeah, in terms of philosophy, it's just very important. Like, when these people, like, concept, the word concept, Begriff, in German means something very specific for Kant, Immanuel Kant. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Um,
But you
yeah,
said something else.
yeah. um, in in Kritik der reinen Vernunft, a critique of pure reason, um, Immanuel Kant's most famous work. So it means something very specific for him, and it means something very specific for Deleuze and Guattari.
All right, so
And
please explain.
it only
only
makes
inter
sense within that.
Okay,
Yeah.
explain to me what a concept is. Yes, please do that.
Yes. It's very frustrating because, yeah, I mean, it's a whole chapter, and I ought to have selected exactly the most exemplary portions of it, which kind of define what a concept is. But I didn't, and that's why I was saying this should really kind of serve as a preliminary discussion of this book, because I need to go into
We
specific
can't really go forward without answering this question, man.
without, without, without digging apart the one simple statement they say. Um, okay, so
Frankly, no further understanding what this is.
you,
I have not I made any progress in understanding this
you have
book
not made
now.
any progress.
Yeah. So
Um, well, so what I mean, we have made some progress in juxtaposing philosophy with science.
no,
In
we
that,
haven't. No, we haven't. What scientists
yeah,
create many
no,
many
we have.
concepts as well as mathematicians, right? So Well, he's very explicit that
Yeah,
mathematicians
yeah,
and
no.
scientists are
But
not.
he does say that philosophy doesn't take measurements. Okay, so there's no measurements going on in philosophy. So we have gotten that far, and we also know that he doesn't say.
So scientists create concepts, but because they take measurements, they're no longer philosophers. Oh, you took a measure, you measured something, now you're no longer in the domain of philosophy.
No. We could no. So we could say they both use concepts, but that philosophers just don't use measurements. That's what you could say. So that we can at least say that philosophers are not dealing with that, and they don't deal with what he calls functions as well, and functives. I'm not sure how they translate it into English. Once again, part of the jargon. Um, and well, just also with the juxtaposition, I would say that he defines art, right, as another, the third domain, philosophy, art, and science. These are the three domains of the intellect, the activities of the intellect, and art is about art. The fundamental units of art are the percept and the affect, the percept et l'affect. Um, and the affect is about inducing emotion into you. Fundamentally, I think that's a relatively fair statement. And the percept um, is the unit of perception, and that's about giving you well a sort of he says a sensation, une sensation. Um, so giving you a perception of whatever of music. He discusses music, or art, of course, of visual art. You see a painting and whatever. So it's giving you a visual, a new experience. So you perceive something different, basically. So it's about manipulating the senses. That's what art is about. Okay, so philosophy isn't doing that either. It's not dealing with percepts and affects. Um, but it is dealing with concepts. So we know that we know that philosophy isn't doing either of those things. And by the way, when you go into someone, we mentioned Derrida once again. He says, fundamentally, and this goes back to Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, famous, some people call him the father of modern linguistics. Anyhow, a Swiss linguist in the early French speaker in the early 20th century. And he said words are defined, I believe Saussure said this, certainly Derrida, words are largely defined in terms of what they are not. Things are defined in terms of what they are not. Much more so than any sort of positive affirmation of what they are. So, from that point of view, we are making some progress. Anyhow, the first chapter of the Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? What is philosophy? Is Qu'est-ce qu'un concept? What is a concept? Okay, and so the entire first chapter is dedicated to this question of what is a concept. Let's see if we can make a sense of the first um, two sentences. I don't think it's going to make very much sense to us. Um, I'm curious, so I need the first three sentences. Or the four. Um, I'm gonna say it really quickly in French. Il n'y a pas de concept simple. Tout concept a des composantes et c'est défini par elles. Il y a donc un chiffre. C'est une multiplicité, bien que toute multiplicité ne soit pas conceptuelle. Okay, so translate that in English. There is not a simple concept. All concept has things it is composed of, composant, and defines itself by these by these what do you say, by these composing elements. And then this next sentence, frankly, doesn't make much sense to me. Now there is a number. So there is a number, like I think he's talking about a number of these composing elements, these elements which compose together a concept. So there is a number. Il y a donc un chiffre. Doesn't make much sense to me. And then he says, c'est une multiplicité. It is a multiplicity, bien que, even though, all multiplicity, toute multiplicité, is not conceptual. So, in my opinion, this is an example of where Deleuze just doesn't make much sense.
I mean,
We know that concepts.
can we not get into the weeds here? And can you just give a brief summary of that chapter rather than going down sentence by sentence because that's rather tedious and postmodern writing is an infamously difficult to read and understand. So just give us a sort of overarching
Yeah, well,
understanding.
yeah, of course, postmodernists don't want us to talk about meta narratives. So what I'm doing is as good as any sort of summary we would say.
Sorry,
So,
sorry. You're all mumbling. I
oh
couldn't
yeah,
hear
yeah.
you.
No, I was just saying, from a postmodernist perspective against Lyotard's postmodernist perspective, we're against meta narratives, and summarizing what a concept is too succinctly would be creating a meta narrative about it. So all we
Yeah,
have
this is
is
a pod, mate. Let's
yeah,
not get too run down here by we're not
that's
postmodernists ourselves. We can
uh,
summarize and let the postmodernists bulk, but we can move
um,
forward.
yeah. Um, okay. He says all concept has a history. He mentioned several philosophers, so Leibniz, so he's name dropping. Bergson, Henri Bergson, very famous philosopher in the beginning of the 20th century. We have Plato. So I'm sure he thinks Plato's ideas. Plato said that everything there's this pure realm of forms, and that's the most real thing. And the world we perceive is just an imperfect copy of that um, pure
Sure,
realm.
yeah. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so, so I know. So we have an example of what a concept is. I think for Deleuze, all of that is a concept. Plato created that concept, this idea of forms. Okay, so we have an example, so that we can start to maybe grasp at something because through specific examples we can get sort of a vague notion of what something might be. Um, yeah, so he says there's not a simple concept. Il n'y a pas de concept simple. So I think what that means is it's going back to that first sentence that we went through, which sounded like babble. But he said every concept has composant, things it is composed of. Okay, and there's no simple concept. So I think there's no concept like Plato's ideas. I think has composite sub concepts which make it up together. And I think what he's saying is every concept has parts which constitute it. There's no like pure concept by itself without any composant things which compose it. Okay, he says le concept est un incorporel, bien qu'il s'incarne ou s'effectue dans les corps. Okay, so to translate this, the concept is non-corporal, not connected to the body, um, even though it incarnates itself or um, effectuates itself in bodies. So it's an abstract thing. That's just maybe what I would get from this. It's an immaterial thing. It's not a physical thing whatsoever. But we are bodies, people who create them, and so therefore it manifests itself through us. That's what maybe I would pull from it. Um,
Okay, okay, we have an example of a concept created. I think another
I mean,
example is
basically so sorry, I'll give you I'll let you I'll give the mic back to you in just a second. I mean we have very many examples of him just saying what a concept saying a statement about a concept. And I think if we were to sum all these together, maybe we would be able to come up with some sort of definition. But I think these are kind of precise statements, and it'd be hard to just reduce them to like a two-sentence definition. Because he says another thing. Yeah, un concept est une hétérogénèse, c'est-à-dire une ordination de ses composantes par zone de voisinage. So a concept is something heterogeneous. Um, that is to say, a ordination, an ordering of its composant of its composing elements by, and this makes no sense to me, zones of neighboring, zone de voisinage. So zones of, I think, maybe neighboring concepts, which it can be compared to. That's one possible interpretation. Anyway,
I completely didn't follow that neighboring concept and zones of
yeah,
neighboring
so
con.
so maybe we have zones. Maybe every one of these every one of these other concepts has a sort of zone associated with it. Maybe and other concepts are sort of juxtaposed with those and are given meaning by the neighboring with other concepts. I mean, it could be a sort of statement about analogy, perhaps. I know analogy. I almost clicked on this one YouTube lecture, I think by Yale professor, and he was saying that the title was that analogy is the fundamental as the foundation of understanding, something like that. So we fundamentally understand things through analogy. That I think is what this lecture is about, and that was like a it was a lecture on psychology, not in philosophy. So
Mhm.
anyhow, it could be sort of saying that analogy. So this comparison, I'm not sure.
So
What?
you're saying that concepts are like analogies, and the purpose of a philosopher is to create analogies.
Um, yeah, perhaps. So,
And why is a
so
mathematician not a philosopher? Because he doesn't take measurements either, you know.
hmm yeah,
And
but
he
he does deal
creates
with functions and he goes into what is it? Because he does towards the end of the book when he's juxtaposing science and philosophy, he does go into mathematics as well. Um, we're going to return to this, and I'm going to have specific passages to quote about this. But he talks about a plane of coordinates, and fundamentally, like that's what they in order to deal with it, in order to we would say conceptualize, or but he would say maybe understand or analyze the external world, the objective world, the material world. He does use this term material world. Um, they kind of create this sort of plane of coordinates and then manipulate things or understand in relation to that. Sort of this, I think, mathematize it, sort of in the way a physicist would, um, and and maybe mathematicians deal with the rules associated with that. Um, yeah, with that sort of calculus of, yeah, it doesn't make very much sense, but um, anyways,
uh,
he does talk about mathematics at the end of the book.
yeah. I'm really not understanding. I think we're a bit stuck here in terms of progress. Um, we were just recording this on a whim. You just finished reading that book. So I think I was hoping to be a bit fresh in your mind, but I guess I didn't give you enough time for prep here. So I think your
Yeah.
understanding of the
So
concept.
I went back to the book a little bit. So I have some more kind of statements about the concept that we can maybe can help us better refine what it means somewhat.
All right, yes. Perhaps you can yeah, enlighten us then.
Yeah. Okay. So he does say that uh, basically, yeah, a concept is something that we create to solve a specific problem. Um, he uses more jargon. So he says it is a sort of event, an événement, and this kind of ties in together with another philosopher called Alain Badiou, a French philosopher, who, if anything, is more impenetrable than Deleuze. I lived with a French philosophy professor for 2 years, last year and the previous year, and he said Badiou. He was just like means nothing to him whatsoever. Like he tried reading his most famous book and he just couldn't understand the word. But anyways, Badiou is famous. His most famous work is L'être et l'événement, being an event, and he talks about how there's certain historical events which embody thought and sort of mean a lot to philosophy and to humanity. I think general statements, but Deleuze uses this term event as a it's an important event that philosophers create to solve a specific problem. And I think he even uses a phrase, if I'm not misquoting, affronter le chaos, which means face the chaos, face chaos. And he actually says that both science and art are also doing this. These are attempts to, uh, once again, affronter le chaos, deal with chaos, conceptualize chaos. You have this chaos, which is we are thrown into, and the intellect, because these are the three domains of the intellect: art, science, and philosophy. These are attempts to kind of make sense of that and organize it into sort of intelligibility. And so that's what we're kind of doing. And the concept is we use concepts and philosophy to do that, to sort of organize this chaos. Concepts are tools, he says, outils, and the tools that we use for this purpose to kind of construct these systems of thought. I think it's fair to say, and yeah, make sense of the chaos. Once again, repeating myself. Um, and this actually, we can tie this to the psychologist Jordan Peterson. He says this as well. He talks about the difference between order and chaos, right?
Yeah.
His famous book, what was it? The last one. I forget what the front of the title was, but I know the bottom of the title was
12 Rules of Life or something.
yeah, 12 Rules for Life. I forgot. 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos.
Ah,
Um, yeah, and so yeah, I think ironically, Jordan Peterson is famous for critiquing the postmodernists as trying to undermine Western civilization and having this fundamentally nihilist worldview, et cetera, et cetera. But he would, I think, he kind of his statements kind of resemble what Deleuze and Guattari say actually in the end of Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? Um, because that's what they're talking about in the final chapters of the book is how art, philosophy, and science are yeah, dealing with the chaos, facing the chaos, and kind of making order. They don't use the term order as l'ordre, as oh, they might say ordination. We did talk about that. So maybe that would be ordering. What we would say in English as ordering. Um, that is what Peterson says. So you have order and chaos, and what we're doing is creating order out of chaos, and chaos is the default that we are of just nature, I suppose. Things are
I
chaotic. We
see.
don't understand. It doesn't make sense. It's a big thing that the existentialists talk about when Heidegger talks about Geworfenheit, thrownness. We're just thrown into existence, it's kind of it just makes no sense. Camus talks about l'absurdité, the absurd, l'absurde, how it's just absurd. We're just thrown in this chaotic mess that is life.
Hmm.
And so yeah, like thought, um, philosophical thought particularly is an attempt to deal with this chaos. That is definitely what Peterson thinks. He also he talks about art very much as well, and he says artists deal with they operate on the border of chaos and order. So the like he says creative artists and creative types. Peterson was actually he's a personality psychologist, so he talks about people's personalities. And he said creative types, people with high and trade openness, operate on the border of chaos and order, and and that's what they do. That's why they're kind of well, they seem to us chaotic. But they're really just trying to push the bounds of what you can express and what you can conceptualize. And actually, this resembles kind of the end of what is philosophy, Qu'est-ce que la philosophie, by Deleuze and Guattari, because what they say is actually these three domains, philosophy, art, and science, they express the other domain in their own terms. So, like science will use its own terms to express a philosophical, talk about philosophical concepts, and maybe we might call it a sort of scientific reductionism, perhaps. And he says art as well expresses philosophy, philosophical concepts using art, using its own tools, using the manipulation of sensation, les percepts, the percepts, And he says modern art is actually an example of this. Modern art, when you have like these blocks of he cites specific examples, um, but you have these like this block of color or something. And these are attempts by the artist to actually express something, express a philosophical idea, express a concept. And they're using their own medium, which is giving you a sensory experience, to do that. Um, and I think he gives some examples of music doing the same as well. Um, and that happens. And he says philosophy can do the same thing as well, sort of express and it's a bit more difficult. This is where we'll go into more examples perhaps next time of how philosophy embodies sensation using concepts, or how it sort of talks about the function of science. Perhaps we could say the philosophy of science, talking about the foundations of science, might constitute this activity of trying to express science using philosophy, using the tool of philosophy. So using concepts to talk about scientific activity, as we were talking about measurement and so forth.
Mm.
Um, so, anyways,
So he would classify the philosophy of science, that endeavor, as philosophy. Would he count that as philosophy?
yeah, I
Is
mean,
it?
if there's an attempt to conceptualize using a concept to articulate, solve a particular problem, namely talking about the foundation of what science is or what mathematics is. And we've got to go through some of these examples because he actually does talk about mathematics, and he does talk about he gives specific examples of some of this. Um, but yeah, I think he would. Now, I don't think he goes in. He doesn't actually use the term philosophy of science in the way we use it to talk about a domain of particularly Anglophone philosophy, what we call analytic philosophy. They talk about these domains of study like the philosophy of science, the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of language. The continental philosophers, the French thinkers, they don't do this as much. Like we do, they don't refer to Jacques Derrida as doing the philosophy of language. That's more associated with like a different tradition. So they kind of they title things differently. They title things as um, phenomenology, or they just use different terms. But this is a sort of speculation. I mean, I can imagine Deleuze saying that what the analytic philosophers are doing in the philosophy of science is philosophizing about using concepts to solve the particular problem of how to sort of understand what science is doing to make order out of chaos, perhaps.
Mm.
Um, without turning into what we talked about earlier as a sort of a mere reflection. And so we'd have to delve into what I don't think the tricky part is I'm not sure how much he uses the term reflection actually in this book. I have to double check that. Use electronic copy and do a control F, search how many times he uses, la réflexion or réfléchir, to reflect, reflection, and juxtapose that with, um, using a concept. Because he does say in that interview that philosophy is not mere reflection, it is the creation of concepts. Um, and as we talked about, it's to solve a particular problem.
Mm.
And actually, he also goes into how he uses the term le personnage conceptuel. So there's actually sort of personalities that philosophers create, conceptual personalities, and these kind of embody these ideas. He gives examples with Nietzsche and some of these other thinkers. But we're going to go into that the next time. I think we're out of time.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think
so
we can start from here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we're a bit out of time, so we'll either continue this, yeah, or restart this the next time. Now that you're a bit more clear on the concept, I had to ask more pointed questions to you, but
mm,
hopefully that was I was joking to you about this off screen, but perhaps you can view this as sort of a work of art, where you see I always thought, or not always, but I think of art as the purpose of art is to convey a sort of experience, and hopefully the experience of listening to this podcast was similar, well, was a is sort of a metaphor or analogy the experience of reading this book where you don't quite know what's going on, and about an
Mm.
hour in, you're not quite sure what you learned, but perhaps you learned something, but you're not quite sure.
Yeah.
I would imagine that's the sort of experience of reading Deleuze's
Well,
book.
using the jargon of the book, it's I'm giving you a percept of it, some perception, a sort of sensory experience, but even more so an affect, a sort of
Yeah.
emotional sensation of not knowing how to make sense of what seems senseless babble. This is what people accuse postmodernist philosophy often of being, especially Deleuze. So
Yeah.
anyhow, I hope it was at least entertaining to some degree, and I would
Yeah.
definitely come back more to this. But anyway,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Until next
hope
time.
you were entertained.
Yeah. Anyways,
But
until next time.
until next time.
Cheers.